The hydraulic press screamed once, sharp enough to cut through decades of familiar factory noise, then everything stopped. For the first time in anyone's memory, Line 3 fell silent before the morning break. The conveyor belt coasted to a reluctant halt. Half-finished steel housings rested beneath suspended robotic arms, frozen in place. Steam drifted lazily from overhead pipes, mixing with the pale winter light that filtered through skylights clouded by years of dust. Somewhere in the distance, a forklift backed up with 3 lonely beeps before its operator realized there was nowhere left to go. People looked toward the disabled machine, then toward each other, not in panic, in the uneasy way people do when they sense that something larger than a broken machine has just happened. The old Riverton manufacturing plant had survived recessions, ownership changes, supply shortages, and more overtime weekends than anyone cared to count. But everyone knew this month was different. After 98 years, the factory was closing. Every remaining shift mattered. Every completed order meant another promise kept to customers who had stayed loyal until the end. More importantly, every completed order helped protect the severance packages that hundreds of workers had quietly counted on as they prepared for uncertain futures. Plant manager Daniel Mercer hurried across the concrete floor, radio pressed against his shoulder. Maintenance? 3 mechanics were already kneeling beside the enormous press. Panels had been removed. Flashlights swept across hydraulic lines and gear assemblies slick with fresh oil. "It's not the pump," one muttered. "Sensor? No. Electrical? Doesn't look like it." The uncertainty spread faster than any confirmed diagnosis. Nearby, welders removed their gloves and waited. Machine operators leaned against silent workstations. Some checked their watches. Others stared at the idle production line as if willing it back to life. Near the far wall, almost unnoticed, an elderly man closed a battered metal toolbox. Arthur Hale moved without urgency. His blue work jacket had faded unevenly over the years, the embroidered company logo almost worn away. The leather gloves tucked into his back pocket had been stitched so many times that the repairs were beginning to overlap each other. Officially, Arthur had retired 19 years earlier. Officially, he wasn't even supposed to be working today. Twice a week he came in as a temporary consultant, mostly repairing forgotten equipment no one else wanted to touch. Younger employees knew him only as the old mechanic. Some didn't know his name at all. Arthur stopped several feet from the disabled press. He didn't crouch. He didn't reach for a wrench. Instead, he listened. His head tilted ever so slightly. Compressed air leaked somewhere beneath the floor. A cooling motor clicked softly as it lost heat. Water condensed inside overhead pipes. The silence between those sounds told him almost as much as the sounds themselves. He took one slow step closer. His eyes settled on the fractured drive assembly. There, a hairline crack no wider than a strand of wire, almost invisible beneath a smear of grease. He said nothing. Daniel noticed him standing there. "You've seen one of these fail before?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. He continued studying the damaged section, as though measuring something only he could see. Finally, he nodded once. "Long time ago. What caused it?" Arthur looked toward the ceiling instead of the machine. "I'm not sure that's the right question." Daniel frowned. "We need answers." Arthur's gaze returned to the cracked assembly. "You need to know why it cracked." The younger mechanics exchanged confused glances. One of them, Tyler, folded his arms. "A crack's a crack." Arthur almost smiled. "No." Then he walked around the opposite side of the press. His fingertips hovered just above the steel housing without touching it. He stopped beside a small inspection opening, barely large enough for a flashlight. "Can someone shine a light in here?" Tyler sighed, but handed over his flashlight anyway. Arthur angled the beam through the opening. Dust floated inside like tiny snowflakes. Then something caught the light. A tiny crescent-shaped machining mark, barely visible. Arthur's expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. The kind that arrives after finding something you hoped never to see again. He lowered the flashlight. Daniel stepped closer. "What is it?" Arthur handed the light back. "Nothing you can fix from here." "Meaning?" Arthur hesitated. "I'll need to check something." "What?" "A storage room." Daniel blinked. "What storage room?" "The old tool archive." One mechanic laughed quietly. "That place has been locked forever." Arthur nodded. "I know." Daniel rubbed his forehead. The replacement engineers are driving in from the regional office. They'll be here by this afternoon. Arthur looked once more at the damaged press. They'll replace parts. And it won't solve this. The confidence in his voice wasn't arrogant. It was almost reluctant, like someone describing rain after noticing dark clouds. Daniel studied the older man carefully. Most consultants loved proving everyone else wrong. Arthur looked as though he wished he weren't right at all. "What exactly are you looking for?" Daniel asked. Arthur remained silent long enough that the sounds of the quiet factory slowly returned around them. Finally he answered, "A mistake." Tyler shook his head. "This machine's almost 30 years old." Arthur nodded again. "Yes. So? It shouldn't have this mark." "What mark?" Arthur didn't explain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small ring holding only 2 old brass keys. He turned them thoughtfully in his hand. "I still have access to the archive." Daniel stared. "I thought all those keys were collected years ago." So did everyone else. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Not because they were astonished, but because Arthur's calm certainty didn't fit the urgency surrounding them. Daniel finally exhaled. "Fine," he signaled to security. "Open the archive." The guard looked puzzled. "Nobody's been in there since." "I know." The sentence drifted away unfinished. Across the factory floor, workers slowly returned to waiting. Coffee cooled inside forgotten mugs. Snow tapped softly against tall windows. Above them, old ventilation fans continued turning with a low mechanical hum that suddenly seemed louder than ever. Arthur began walking toward the oldest section of the building. His pace never changed. Elena Cruz, a second-year maintenance apprentice, watched him disappear down a dim corridor lined with retired machines waiting for demolition. Something about the way he walked bothered her. Not because he looked frightened, because he looked like someone returning to a place he'd spent years trying to forget. Curiosity outweighed hesitation. Keeping several steps behind, she quietly followed. The hallway grew colder. Dust thickened beneath their boots. Paint peeled from brick walls where faded safety posters still clung stubbornly after decades. At the corridor's end stood a steel door hidden behind unused shelving. Its padlock looked older than Elena. The security guard struggled before the mechanism finally released with a heavy metallic click. The door groaned open. Cold, stale air drifted out, carrying the scent of aged timber, machine oil, and paper that had slept untouched for years. Arthur stepped inside without switching on the lights. He seemed to know exactly where everything was. Sunlight slipping through a cracked window, outlined shelves stacked with forgotten gauges, obsolete bearings, wooden patterns, drafting tools, and boxes whose labels had long since faded. He stopped in front of a large wooden crate, tucked beneath a canvas sheet. Dust coated every surface except one narrow line where someone had once rested a hand. Arthur slowly pulled away the canvas. Elena couldn't see the entire crate from the doorway. Only the words burned carefully into the weathered wood. "Do not install until I'm gone." Arthur stood perfectly still. His hand hovered over the lid. But he didn't open it. Arthur's fingers rested lightly on the weathered crate, but the lid remained closed. The silence inside the archive felt different from the silence on the factory floor. Out there, machines had stopped unexpectedly. In here, time itself seemed to have stopped years ago. Dust floated through thin shafts of winter sunlight leaking from a cracked window high above. Rows of forgotten tools stood where they had been left decades earlier, as if the people who once used them had only stepped away for lunch. Behind the doorway, Elena held her breath. She knew she should leave. This wasn't her place. Yet something about the old mechanic's expression kept her rooted where she stood. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It looked more like grief meeting an old friend. Arthur finally noticed her reflection in the dusty window. "You've been following me." His voice carried no anger. Elena stepped into the room, embarrassed. I didn't mean to spy." "No? I just wanted to understand." Arthur looked at her for a long moment before giving a small nod. Most people stop asking questions once they think they already know the answer. He reached into his pocket and produced the same brass key that had opened the archive. It fit a smaller lock fixed to the crate. The mechanism resisted before giving way with a dull click. Arthur lifted the lid. Instead of spare machine parts, Elena found dozens of carefully wrapped bundles, each protected with oilcloth and labeled in neat handwriting. Arthur unwrapped the first bundle. Inside lay a precision machined steel gear, unlike anything she had seen in the factory. Its teeth were polished almost like mirrors. Every edge had been finished by hand. She picked it up carefully. "It's beautiful." Arthur smiled faintly. "It wasn't built to be beautiful. It looks different." "It is." He removed another package, then another. Soon the old workbench was covered with shafts, bearings, valve assemblies, measuring fixtures, and hand-drawn engineering sketches. None carried company logos. None appeared in any maintenance manual Elena had studied. She looked from the parts to Arthur. "Who made these?" "I did." The answer was so simple that it almost sounded ordinary. Yet nothing about the collection before her was ordinary. She unfolded one of the drawings. Every measurement had been written with remarkable precision. Margins were filled with calculations, corrections, and tiny notes explaining why certain angles had been changed by less than a single degree. "This must have taken years." Arthur nodded. "It did." "You designed all of this after retirement?" "No." He folded another drawing with practiced care. "I started while I still worked here." Elena frowned. "Then why has nobody ever mentioned it?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward a dusty filing cabinet tucked against the wall. Inside rested dozens of black notebooks, their corners softened by years of use. He handed her the first one. The opening page contained only a date, 20 years earlier. Below it, written in careful pencil, "Failure isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins with something everyone agrees to ignore." Elena slowly turned the pages. Every notebook documented experiments performed after regular shifts had ended. Machine adjustments, stress calculations, improved cooling systems, safer hydraulic sequencing, new bearing designs, hundreds upon hundreds of handwritten observations. Some pages were stained with grease. Others carried faint rings left by coffee mugs long since emptied. One page even contained dried fingerprints where oil had mixed with graphite dust. They weren't inventions created in a laboratory. They were solutions born from thousands of ordinary workdays. "You never showed these to anyone?" "I wasn't trying to." "But why?" Arthur leaned against the old bench. "When you've worked somewhere long enough." He paused. "Why? You stop asking who deserves credit." Elena wasn't convinced. "That's not the same as hiding everything." Arthur's eyes wandered toward the dusty window. Outside, demolition equipment sat waiting beyond the fence. Huge excavators. Their steel arms rested quietly beneath gray clouds. They weren't hidden. No, they were simply never needed. Before Elena could reply, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Daniel Mercer appeared in the doorway. "There you are." His eyes widened as he noticed the collection spread across the bench. "What exactly am I looking at?" Arthur answered without turning. "Options." Daniel picked up one of the blueprints. "I've never seen these." "No, our engineering department doesn't have copies." "They wouldn't." Daniel looked more closely. "These modifications. They're improvements." Arthur remained silent. Daniel turned another page, then another. His expression gradually shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "Some of these are dated before the production line was even upgraded." "Yes. You redesigned half this system." Arthur quietly corrected him. "I redesigned the parts that kept failing." Daniel lowered the notebook. "Why wasn't any of this implemented?" Arthur looked toward the far end of the archive where an old drafting table stood beneath a faded desk lamp. For several seconds he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Some things were." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Arthur walked to the drafting table and opened a narrow wooden drawer. Inside rested a single photograph. Its edges had yellowed with age. 5 people stood together beside a newly installed production line. All were smiling. One man stood in the center, wearing a pressed white engineering shirt. Arthur stood near the edge of the photograph in grease-stained coveralls, half hidden behind everyone else. Daniel studied the picture. "I recognize him." Arthur nodded. "Richard Lawson, the former chief engineer. He retired the year before I did." Daniel looked back at Arthur. Everyone said Lawson modernized the entire factory. Arthur carefully took the photograph back. "He modernized a great deal." The answer felt incomplete. Elena noticed it too. "What aren't you saying?" Arthur ran his thumb gently across the faded image. "There was a winter much like this one." His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "The production line kept breaking." He spoke slowly. as though choosing each memory with care. 3 failures in 1 month. The company was losing contracts. People were afraid layoffs would begin. Elena listened without interrupting. Arthur continued. Richard hadn't slept properly for days. He carried the whole responsibility himself. Daniel crossed his arms. So what happened? Arthur smiled sadly. I couldn't watch him drown. He placed the photograph back inside the drawer, so I stayed after everyone went home. The archive seemed even quieter now. Outside, the wind rattled an old window pane. Arthur's words settled heavily in the room. I rebuilt the drive assembly from scratch. Elena stared at him. In 1 night? Arthur shook his head. In 6. I never went home. Daniel looked around the room again, at the notebooks, the parts, the drawings. The evidence had been sitting here all along. But the company records say Lawson developed the redesign. Arthur didn't deny it. They do. Then they're wrong. Arthur finally met Daniel's eyes. They're incomplete. Neither of them understood. Not yet. Arthur closed the notebook gently. The machine on line 3 didn't fail because it's old. He looked toward the factory beyond the archive walls. It failed because someone replaced one small component years later. The wrong component. Daniel's expression tightened. So you knew. I recognized the machining mark. The replacement part? Arthur nodded once. I've seen that mark before. Where? Arthur's gaze drifted toward the unopened bundles still resting inside the crate. It belongs to a manufacturer we stopped using 20 years ago. The room fell quiet again. Daniel's radio crackled suddenly. The replacement engineers had arrived. They're asking for maintenance records, the voice announced. Daniel looked from the radio to Arthur, then to the notebooks, then back again. For the first time that morning, he realized the most valuable engineering archive in the building had never been stored in the company offices. It had been waiting inside this forgotten room, hidden not by secrecy, but by a man who had never believed the work belonged to him alone. Arthur slowly closed the crate. There is one more notebook, he said quietly. I've never let anyone read it. Elena noticed something different in his voice. Not hesitation, preparation. Whatever was written in that final notebook wasn't another technical record. It was the reason all the others had remained locked away for 20 years. Compressed air leaked somewhere beneath the floor. A cooling motor clicked softly as it lost heat. Water condensed inside overhead pipes. The silence between those sounds told him almost as much as the sounds themselves. He took one slow step closer. His eyes settled on the fractured drive assembly. There, a hairline crack no wider than a strand of wire, almost invisible beneath a smear of grease. He said nothing. Daniel noticed him standing there. You've seen one of these fail before? Arthur didn't answer immediately. He continued studying the damaged section, as though measuring something only he could see. Finally, he nodded once. Long time ago. What caused it? Arthur looked toward the ceiling instead of the machine. I'm not sure that's the right question. Daniel frowned. We need answers. Arthur's gaze returned to the cracked assembly. You need to know why it cracked. The younger mechanics exchanged confused glances. One of them, Tyler, folded his arms. A crack's a crack. Arthur almost smiled. No. Then he walked around the opposite side of the press. His fingertips hovered just above the steel housing without touching it. He stopped beside a small inspection opening, barely large enough for a flashlight. Can someone shine a light in here? Tyler sighed, but handed over his flashlight anyway. Arthur angled the beam through the opening. Dust floated inside like tiny snowflakes. Then something caught the light. A tiny crescent-shaped machining mark, barely visible. Arthur's expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. The kind that arrives after finding something you hoped never to see again. He lowered the flashlight. Daniel stepped closer. What is it? Arthur handed the light back. Nothing you can fix from here. Meaning? Arthur hesitated. I'll need to check something. What? A storage room. Daniel blinked. What storage room? The old tool archive. One mechanic laughed quietly. That place has been locked forever. Arthur nodded. I know. Daniel rubbed his forehead. The replacement engineers are driving in from the regional office. They'll be here by this afternoon. Arthur looked once more at the damaged press. They'll replace parts. And it won't solve this. The confidence in his voice wasn't arrogant. It was almost reluctant, like someone describing rain after noticing dark clouds. Daniel studied the older man carefully. Most consultants loved proving everyone else wrong. Arthur looked as though he wished he weren't right at all. "What exactly are you looking for?" Daniel asked. Arthur remained silent long enough that the sounds of the quiet factory slowly returned around them. Finally he answered, "A mistake." Tyler shook his head. "This machine's almost 30 years old." Arthur nodded again. "Yes. So? It shouldn't have this mark." "What mark?" Arthur didn't explain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small ring holding only 2 old brass keys. He turned them thoughtfully in his hand. "I still have access to the archive." Daniel stared. "I thought all those keys were collected years ago." So did everyone else. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Not because they were astonished, but because Arthur's calm certainty didn't fit the urgency surrounding them. Daniel finally exhaled. "Fine," he signaled to security. "Open the archive." The guard looked puzzled. "Nobody's been in there since." "I know." The sentence drifted away unfinished. Across the factory floor, workers slowly returned to waiting. Coffee cooled inside forgotten mugs. Snow tapped softly against tall windows. The final notebook was smaller than the others. Its black cover had faded to a soft gray, and one corner was held together with a strip of aging cloth tape. Unlike the journals filled with measurements and engineering sketches, this one carried no label. Arthur held it for several moments before placing it gently on the workbench. "I never intended for anyone to read this," he said quietly. Outside the archive, the factory slowly began to stir again. The replacement engineers had arrived, their voices echoing faintly through the corridor as they unloaded cases of diagnostic equipment. The familiar sounds of boots against concrete and metal carts rolling across the floor drifted into the room, reminding everyone that time was moving forward whether they were ready or not. Daniel looked at the notebook. "If what's in there can help save line 3, we should know." Arthur nodded. "It can." He opened the cover. The first pages contained no diagrams, only handwriting. Neat, careful, almost painfully deliberate. Arthur cleared his throat before reading. "Some machines fail because of worn parts. Others fail because people become afraid to admit they've made a mistake." He paused. The words seemed heavier now than when he'd written them 20 years ago. Elena remained silent. Arthur continued. "The winter of 2006 wasn't just hard on the factory. It was hard on Richard." He closed the notebook for a moment, looking somewhere far beyond the dusty archive walls. He'd lost his wife the year before. He was raising his grandson alone. He barely slept. The pressure from management never stopped. Daniel lowered his eyes. Arthur took a slow breath. The redesign that failed wasn't careless. It was rushed. No engineer does their best work when they're carrying grief. The room grew still. Arthur continued reading. "I found the mistake just before production started. If I reported it, Richard would lose everything he had spent 30 years building. If I stayed quiet, hundreds of workers could lose their jobs." Elena looked up. "So you changed it?" Arthur nodded. "I stayed every night after second shift. I remachined the drive assembly. I recalculated the hydraulic timing. I rebuilt the stress points. No one asked me to. No one even knew I was there." Daniel spoke softly. "Richard discovered it?" "The 6th night." Arthur smiled faintly at the memory. "He walked into the machine shop around 2 in the morning. He didn't say a word. He simply watched me work." The memory unfolded in Arthur's mind as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. A younger Richard Lawson standing in the doorway, coat still dusted with snow, the smell of hot steel, the glow of a single work lamp. Coffee gone cold beside scattered blueprints. Neither man speaking for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, Richard had broken the silence. Arthur had shrugged without looking up. "Almost. Why?" "Because it'll work." Richard had laughed once, not out of humor, out of relief. Back in the archive, Arthur carefully turned another page. The next morning, management announced the redesign as Richard's solution. Elena frowned. "You could have corrected them." "I could have. But you didn't." Arthur shook his head. Both Daniel and Elena looked up. He told them exactly what happened. Daniel blinked. "They ignored him?" Arthur smiled sadly. "They thought he was being modest." The irony settled heavily over the room. Richard had told the truth. No one believed him. Arthur had remained silent. Everyone assumed the story was settled. Years passed. Promotions came and went. Factories modernized, management changed, people retired. The truth quietly gathered dust inside a forgotten archive. Daniel leaned against the workbench. You carried this alone for 20 years. Arthur looked around the room. I wasn't alone. He rested his hand on the notebooks. I had the work. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the radio crackled again. Maintenance to line 3. The engineers need assistance immediately. Daniel looked toward the door. Arthur closed the notebook. Let's go. Line 3 looked different now. Portable floodlights illuminated the disabled press. Toolboxes surrounded the machine. 3 corporate engineers studied digital schematics displayed on rugged laptops. One of them looked up as Arthur approached. We've traced the failure. Arthur nodded politely. I'm sure you have. We'll need to replace the entire drive assembly. Arthur glanced toward the damaged housing. No. The engineer frowned. The fracture has spread. Yes. But that's the symptom. Arthur walked around the machine exactly as he had that morning. He pointed toward a nearly invisible retaining collar hidden behind a hydraulic manifold. Remove that. One engineer hesitated. Why? Because that's where the problem began. After a brief exchange of uncertain looks, the collar was removed. Behind it sat a thin spacer ring, barely 3 millimeters thick. Arthur held it beneath the inspection light. A tiny crescent-shaped machining mark gleamed against the steel. The same mark he had recognized hours earlier. He placed one of the components from the archive beside it. Perfect match. The replacement supplier changed the alloy composition. They saved money. They also changed how stress travels through the assembly. The youngest engineer examined both parts. His expression shifted. That would explain everything. Arthur nodded. It took 19 years. The engineer looked genuinely impressed. I never would have found that. Arthur smiled gently. You weren't here when the machine learned how to talk. The younger man laughed quietly. I guess not. For the first time all day, the tension on the production floor eased. Using one of Arthur's preserved components and his original measurements, the team carefully rebuilt the damaged section. Hours later, Daniel gave the signal. Power returned. Hydraulic pumps rumbled to life. The massive press completed one slow cycle, then another. Steel moved smoothly along the conveyor. No vibration, no unusual noise, just the deep, steady rhythm the factory had known for decades. Workers nearby stopped what they were doing, not to cheer, simply to listen. Some smiled. Others quietly returned to work. The machine was speaking its familiar language again. As the line resumed production, Daniel walked over to Arthur. I've spent years believing this factory survived because of good management. Arthur chuckled softly. It survived because people kept showing up. Daniel looked around the building, at welders, operators, electricians, janitors, forklift drivers, mechanics, thousands of ordinary shifts, millions of unnoticed decisions. Arthur had simply been one of them, perhaps the best of them, but still one of them. Late that afternoon, as snow began melting beneath a brief patch of sunlight, Elena returned to the archive alone. She carefully packed every notebook into protective storage boxes. Each drawing, each journal, each handmade component. None would be forgotten again. Before closing the final box, she found a folded envelope tucked inside the last notebook. There was no address, only one sentence written across the front. For whoever repairs this place after me. Inside was a single sheet. Arthur's handwriting filled only half the page. Machines always wear out. Buildings eventually close. The work that matters most is teaching someone else how to care. If these notes help you solve one problem I never lived to see, then they've already done their job. Elena folded the letter carefully. Outside, Line 3 continued running through its final production order. Its steady rhythm echoed through the old factory one last time. Arthur stood quietly beside the machine, one grease-stained hand resting against the warm steel. No speeches, no ceremony. No applause, just an old mechanic listening to a machine he had quietly protected for 20 years. For the first time in a long while, the sound no longer carried the weight of a secret. It simply sounded like home. What remains after the last shift? The factory's final whistle sounded at exactly 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. For nearly a century, that whistle had marked the end of ordinary workdays, Overtime Saturdays, winter storms, summer heat waves, and thousands of quiet routines repeated by generations of hands. This time, no one hurried toward the parking lot. The sound lingered across the empty loading yard before fading into the cold evening air. Inside Riverton Manufacturing, machines completed their last cycles one by one. The welders shut off their torches, electric motors wound down into silence, conveyor belts coasted gently to a stop, forklifts returned to their charging stations. Someone switched off the giant compressor that had hummed beneath the building for longer than most employees had been alive. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar, not painful, respectful. Arthur stood beside line 3, his toolbox resting at his feet. The repaired press had worked flawlessly through the final production run. Its steady rhythm never faltered again. One by one, workers passed by the machine before leaving. Some touched the steel frame. Others simply looked at it for a moment. No one laughed, no one forced conversation. People have a way of saying goodbye without words. Daniel Mercer walked across the production floor, carrying a cardboard box filled with office files. He stopped beside Arthur. "I've been thinking." Arthur looked up. "That can be dangerous." Daniel smiled. "I finally found the maintenance reports from 20 years ago." Arthur didn't answer. "They don't mention your name once." "They weren't supposed to." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know." For a moment, they simply watched sunlight stretch across the concrete floor through the high factory windows. Dust floated lazily in the golden light. It almost looked like snowfall indoors. "I've spent the last 2 days correcting the records," Daniel said. Arthur sighed quietly. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." Arthur shook his head. "No." Daniel looked confused. "The records should be accurate." "They should. So why object?" Arthur rested both hands on the handle of his old toolbox. "Because accuracy isn't always the same thing as fairness." Daniel frowned. Arthur continued, "If you erase Richard's contribution to this place, you'll be making the same mistake all over again." Daniel considered that. "He still led the project. He carried responsibilities I never did. He made decisions I never had to make." Arthur smiled faintly. "I fixed one machine. Richard protected an entire factory." The words settled heavily between them. Finally, Daniel nodded. "Then we'll tell the whole story." Arthur's eyes softened. "That sounds better." Over the following week, demolition crews arrived. Large orange excavators rolled through the gates before sunrise. Surveyors marked walls with bright paint. Temporary fencing surrounded the oldest buildings. Yet before any demolition began, the town council organized one final walkthrough for former employees and their families. There were no television cameras, no politicians giving speeches, just people returning to a place that had shaped their lives. Children wandered through departments where their grandparents had once worked. Retired welders argued, good-naturedly, about which machines had been the most reliable. Old friends recognized one another after decades apart. Every corner of the factory carried someone's memory. Near the maintenance workshop, Elena had arranged a small display. Nothing elaborate. A wooden table, several notebooks, Arthur's repaired measuring tools, a pair of worn leather gloves. Beside them sat a handwritten sign, "The hands behind the machines." People stopped, read, smiled. Some wiped away quiet tears. An elderly woman approached the table, carrying a faded photograph. She studied Arthur for several moments before speaking. "My husband worked second shift here." Arthur looked at the photograph. He recognized the face immediately. "Frank Donovan." She nodded. "He always said there was a mechanic who somehow kept impossible machines alive." Arthur laughed softly. "Frank exaggerated." She smiled. "No. He admired you." Arthur looked away for a moment. "I admired him too." She carefully placed the photograph beside the display. He would have wanted it here. Later that afternoon, Elena found Arthur sitting alone outside the old machine shop. He was drinking coffee from the same dented metal mug he had carried for years. She sat beside him. "They're talking about turning this property into a technical training center." Arthur looked toward the empty buildings. "I heard. They want to preserve one section of the maintenance shop." He smiled. "That's a good idea." "They've asked if you'll help." Arthur chuckled. "I thought I retired." "You've been saying that for 19 years. He couldn't argue with that. The wind carried the familiar smell of oil, cold steel, and damp concrete across the yard. Soon, even those scents would disappear. Elena hesitated before asking the question that had stayed with her since the archive. Can I ask you something? Arthur nodded. Were you ever angry? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched a flock of birds circle above the factory roof. For a while. At Richard? No. At myself. She waited. I believed being unnoticed made me stronger. He turned the empty coffee mug slowly between his hands. But silence has a cost. What changed? Arthur smiled gently. You asked questions. Elena laughed. That's all? Most people stopped. You didn't. She looked toward the maintenance building. I almost didn't follow you that day. I'm glad you did. 3 months later, construction crews returned, not to tear everything down, to build something new. The oldest production hall had become a bright vocational training center, filled with workbenches, modern tools, and classrooms overlooking the remaining section of the original factory floor. Students from across the region gathered there to learn machining, welding, industrial maintenance, and mechanical design. On opening day, Arthur arrived before sunrise. Old habits. He unlocked the workshop, switched on the lights, and stood quietly in the center of the room. Everything smelled different. Fresh lumber, new paint, clean steel. Yet one object remained exactly where it belonged, his old workbench. Restored, but not polished. The scratches remained, the burn marks remained, even the small initials carved beneath one corner had been carefully preserved. A group of apprentices entered, talking excitedly among themselves. One young student noticed Arthur adjusting a vise. Excuse me, sir. Arthur looked up. Yes? Were you one of the mechanics here? Arthur considered the question, then smiled. I was one of many. The student extended a hand. I'm hoping to become one. Arthur shook it firmly. Then you've already started. As morning sunlight filled the workshop, the sounds of new voices replaced the echoes of old machines. The factory itself had reached the end of its story, but the craft that had lived inside its walls had not. Arthur watched the apprentices gather around the old workbench, opening fresh notebooks and asking the same kinds of questions that had once guided him through countless long nights. For the first time in 20 years, he no longer felt like the keeper of a secret. He felt exactly what he had always hoped to be, a mechanic whose greatest repair was never a machine. It was making sure the knowledge would keep working long after he was gone.